Welcome back to the story check-in for educator.com. And in this lesson, we are going to be discussing conflicts. Turns out you can't be a human being without conflicts, and you can't have a story without conflicts either. Here's the first story that I'm going to share with you today. A man wakes up. He thinks to himself, I want a ham and cheese omelet. He walks out of his apartment building and goes to a cafe across the street. He orders an omelet, eats, and goes home. He even remembered to tip his waitress. Now I'm going to show you the next version of this story. A man wakes up late because his power is out. He thinks, I want an omelet. He fumbles around in the dark until he finds his keys. Frustrated at the power loss, then he opens the window and sees that the cafe's windows are boarded up across the street. He hears sirens and the noise of helicopters, and then he sees dead bodies stumble through the streets. Oh no, cried the man, it's a zombie apocalypse. Which story sounded more interesting to you? Well, I certainly hope that it's story 2, even if you don't like zombies. That's still a lot more interesting than eat omelet, go home. One of the great film producers of the 20th century was a fellow by the name of Alfred Hitchcock. He wrote a lot of scary stories, but this applies to everything. Drama is real life with the dull parts removed. Drama is real life with the dull parts removed. So, what makes something exciting and not dull? How do I know when to just remove something when it's boring in a story? Well, a good conflict. You have to generate that. You have to see that in a story to be concerned about the story. Otherwise, it's just going to be a sleeper. Now, there are several types of conflicts, and these are all kind of archetypes, if you will, several different kinds that most people who are reading books and most people who are writing books generally agree on. Now, if you think that there are more types of conflicts than this, go ahead, let me know, and we'll share it with everybody. But for now, let's just go over these. First off, we have to understand conflicts as kind of obstacles. A character or a group wants something, but there's something in between them and the goal. Think about story 2. Our man wants an omelet. Well, what's in his way? Well, it's not just a street anymore. It's the zombie apocalypse is between him and his omelet. Maybe he's never going to get that omelet, but I bet you I could write an entire story about a man who just really wants an omelet, and he will do anything in the zombie apocalypse to get it. But there are other types of examples like that. Think about any movie that you've seen. Think about the beginning of the movie. You learn who the main character is, right? Do you learn about who his friends are? Do you learn about what mission they're on, what they want to do, what they want to accomplish? But do they get it right away? Well, no. If they did, it would be a very short and very boring movie. So there's an entire next section, Acts 2 and 3, if you remember, that are all about this conflict, this obstacle, this thing that is between the characters we like and their goal. Here's one type of conflict. We have what are called person versus person conflicts. Most commonly, that's just the hero versus a villain. Voldemort wants to kill Harry. Harry wants to live and kill Voldemort. Darth Vader wants to run the Empire. Luke Skywalker doesn't want him to be his father. You kind of get exactly how that goes. But there's another way that we can have a person versus person conflict, and that's what I call ally versus ally. Now, wait a minute, you might be thinking. Allies are on the same side. They want the same thing. There can't be any conflict between allies. Yes, there can. And when we have ally versus ally conflict, that makes those characters more believable, more likable, and it makes the story more interesting. So, let's go ahead and we have an example here. I have a lawyer, and I'm going to put L for lawyer, and he's a really, really high, powerful lawyer, and he's actually a good lawyer. He is a prosecuting attorney who wants to clean out the city and get all the scum in prison. Now, I also have a police detective. I'm going to put D for detective. This detective wants a clean city. He wants the criminal element removed. He wants all the bad guys locked up. But this detective also knows that his police department is completely corrupt. They take bribes. They're in with the mob. They're maybe doing some drugs too. Now, he understands that, hey, I want to clean up the city too, but I got a corrupt police force and I have to work with that. The lawyer says, hey, 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 we need to arrest those cops too. Both the lawyer and the detective want the same thing. They want a clean, safe city. But this detective, he has to deal with some things the lawyer doesn't have to deal with. And that lawyer, he's a little bit more high-minded, he's a little bit more ideal than the detective. That's an ally versus ally conflict. And if you have a story where the allies just want the same thing and they're the same person, can you imagine how boring their dialogue would be? They'd just be exchanging information. The bad guys are over there. Let's go get them. No, 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 no. That's boring. So, be aware that person-person conflict doesn't mean just hero versus villain. Also, ally versus ally. Another type of conflict is person versus nature. There was a famous movie that came out called Into the Wild. It's all about this very wealthy kid who read a lot of Jack London novels and decided, I'm going to go live alone in Alaska. Now that might sound crazy, but if you read a lot of Jack London and you really like it, it doesn't sound so crazy anymore. But he did that. He went off into the wild and contended with nature. And it actually turns out, well, I'm going to let you guess whether nature won or not. I'm not going to tell you. But that's an example of a person versus nature. Another example of person versus nature conflict is imagine a bunch of pioneers who are going from the eastern United States and they're crossing the Oregon Trail. Are they going to run short of food? Are they going to have to cross rivers? Are they going to have to hunt animals? Are they going to have to chop down trees and build shelter? Are they going to have to find sticks to build fires? This is all people versus nature conflict. It's a group of people who are trying to get somewhere. They want to get to Oregon, but in between their home countries and Oregon, they have a lot of people versus nature conflict. Now, I know maybe some of you who might remember the video game that, that's not the only conflict they face, but a lot of it is person versus nature conflict. Anytime we're fighting animals, that is a person versus nature conflict. There's another famous movie that was based on a true story that took place in the 19th century in Africa called Ghost in the Darkness. A heroic, British Army officer goes to Africa to build a bridge. He's got a lot of men building his bridge, and he's got 2 lions that are hunting down and eating his men. Lions don't normally hunt people, and these lions are just doing it for fun. He has to protect his men from these lions that are called the Ghost in the Darkness. And that's what he does. He is contending man versus nature. Bang. Not going to tell you how the story ends, but it ends well. Go ahead and look it up. Ghost in the Darkness, go to Wikipedia, you'll find it. But that is a person versus nature conflict. Another favorite type of conflict is person or small group of people against society. Now in America, we love to tell these stories. We love about that lone hero who's fighting against a corrupt system all by himself, and we write stories like V for Vendetta. V for Vendetta, if you remember, is about the guy who wore the Guy Fawkes mask and was fighting against a corrupt fascist England. Now, would you believe me if I told you that V for Vendetta was written by an anarchist? Somebody who wants no government at all? Well, that's the ultimate person versus society, right? I don't like this government at all, and I am so against society that I'm just going to oppose it. Maybe a more tamer version might be Robin Hood. What's Robin Hood? Well, he's a noble who realizes that, oh man, this society is really corrupt. And I'm going to rob from the corrupt rich and give to the deserving poor. That's an example of person versus society conflict. Now, is it just Robin Hood or Robin Hood and his band of merry men? Well, of course it's his band of merry men too. So this might be small group of people versus society. And you can think of all kinds of person versus society conflicts if you're reading along. Person versus machine. This shows up mostly 9 times out of 10 in science fiction. And it's because it's only in science fiction that the robot armies are coming to get you. There's a famous movie called I, Robot, where Will Smith is fighting an army of robots all by himself. Now, that's also kind of a person versus society conflict, but you do get it that it's person versus machine. Now, I suppose I could tell a tamer story. What if I have a person who really, really needs to deliver a lot of medicine to a starving village in Africa, but his car keeps breaking down? What's the main obstacle here? It's that car. It's that car that keeps breaking down, and I have all this medicine that I got to get to this starving village in Africa. That's an example of a person versus machine conflict. Now, the machine's not conscious, the machine's not a character, the machine's not an agent, but, I mean, kind of like nature, that's the source of his problems. That's his obstacle. That's a person versus machine conflict. If you guys want, I bet you could find the story The Veldt by Ray Bradbury on the internet, because it was originally published in 1950, and you will find a very short story that's all about a person versus machine conflict. And actually, it's more like parents versus machine, but I'm not going to ruin that for you. And finally, we have what's common in very dense literature and very kind of high-minded literature. You know, if it's written by a Russian author or, maybe Jane Austen, possibly, you'll have a person versus self. An example of a person versus self conflict is a moral conflict. Imagine that the lead character has been taught that something is right his entire life. And then all of a sudden, he feels that maybe it's not right. That's an example of a moral conflict. So, a quick concrete example would be there is a famous story called The Lottery. And in The Lottery, we find out that, well, I can't ruin the story for you, but we find out that people are picked to die. People are picked to die by the lottery, and they die by stoning. Now, can you imagine one character who's in this society and he's been told, this is the right thing to do, this is the way our society works, and this is moral to stone this person. And he's there holding this rock, and he's thinking to himself, this is kind of crazy. I can't believe I'm throwing a rock at a person to kill them. That's a moral conflict. We look at that and we think it's obviously wrong, but our character, our protagonist, has been taught that it's right the whole time. How about an emotional conflict? Have you ever seen a romantic comedy? Romantic comedies always have emotional conflicts. The boy loves the girl, but the girl doesn't love the boy back, so the boy has to figure out how to get his emotions in order. Girl loves the boy loves the girl, but the girl is afraid to get into a relationship. That's another example of an emotional conflict. These show up in romantic comedies and movies all the time. They're always going to be there. More deeper emotional conflicts could be something like, we could go back to my lawyer and detective story. Maybe this detective is also having an emotional conflict. Maybe he has seen somebody important to him killed, and now he's thinking about that every time that he wants to arrest somebody. Maybe the last time he tried to arrest somebody, his partner was murdered right in front of him. Maybe he's experiencing a little bit of cowardice and trepidation about fighting crime right now. That's an example of an emotional conflict. An intellectual conflict is pretty rare. It's pretty uncommon. But an intellectual conflict means that a character or group of characters have always been taught that something is true. And now they are faced with circumstances that are telling them that maybe this is not true. And our story is going to be about how the character resolves this intellectual conflict. It's pretty uncommon because moral conflicts and emotional conflicts are usually much more interesting, but you will occasionally find intellectual conflicts in stories. They're usually small, minor points, but you'll find them. Now, conflict in a story doesn't make a story. The conflict has to be done well. If I took characters and I rolled dice to decide what kind of conflicts I had, and I wrote a story in order with that, not a good story does it make. And I'm going to show you why. With apologies to those of you who are under the age of 20 and really enjoyed Star Wars Episode 1. One conflict in Star Wars Episode 1 is the Trade Federation versus Naboo. What? And our main character is Anakin Skywalker. Who? If you've never seen Star Wars Episode 1 and you don't know what the Trade Federation or Naboo is, you are about as confused and in the dark as anybody who watched the movie. A lot of people have watched this movie over and over again, and it's never really shown in the movie who these two groups are and what this conflict is about. We just know the Trade Federation doesn't like Naboo, and we're told that, and we're not shown that, and we're all confused. Then we have a main character, Anakin Skywalker, who is from another planet, and he doesn't know anything about this conflict, and he accidentally blows up a ship at the end of the movie, but this conflict that started the movie is completely out of his understanding, and it's completely out of his control. This is an example of how to do conflict poorly. Things are just kind of arbitrarily thrown in there, and we don't understand them. Now I will show you how conflict is done well. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Students are petrified by a giant evil snake. The heir of Slytherin, who we don't know, is trying to open the chamber. If that happens, all non-pure-blood wizards will die. Harry is our protagonist, our main character. He attends Hogwarts, and people close to him are affected by this. Do you remember Hermione? Like that, because she almost got petrified by the snake, by the basilisk. Do you remember the end of the story? Was someone else important to Harry affected by this? What makes this a better conflict than Star Wars Episode 1? Well, it's a couple things. We need to know the consequences of failure, or at least the rewards of success. What happens if Harry fails? Well, the snake is going to come out of the chamber, and all non-pure bloods are going to die. This conflict must affect the lead characters. How does this Chamber of Secrets opening affect Harry? Well, because Ginny's affected by it, Hermione's affected by it, and his entire school is affected by it. And Harry cares about his friends. So that's very important. But one of the most important and one of the most intangible things to a good conflict is we have to imagine ourselves in the character's shoes. Now, I've never been afraid of a giant snake, but I have gone to school. And because I've gone to school and I've been a grade school student, I can kind of relate to Harry's experience right here. And I can imagine, wow, if I was Harry or one of Harry's friends, what would I do? If my dad had disappeared and I hated school and I felt like a loser, how would I react if somebody said, hey, we're going to go find our father? That's an example of Wrinkle in Time. So remember these three things, especially when we get to the end of our lessons and you're writing your own stories. So, let's think about Wrinkle in Time now. What type of conflicts have shown up? Who experiences an internal, emotional conflict? That is an example of a person versus self conflict, right? But is that the only conflict in the story? Can there be more than one conflict going on at the same time? Absolutely. So what's one obstacle between the main characters and their goal? Hey, what are they after? Well, they're looking for their dad, but what are some obstacles? Is their dad just over there in the next room and they got to open the door and say, hi, Dad? No. Finally, have you noticed any conflicts between allies in this story so far? Any conflicts at all? Does Meg always get along with Calvin and Charles? Maybe, maybe not. Is there any conflicts, any disagreements, any arguments that they have? Watch for that. That's an ally versus ally conflict, and it will show up. Brave New World, on the other hand, is a little different. What is unique about this Brave New World? Well, honestly, they work very, very hard to make a society where there are no conflicts at all. If you want something, you should have it, because everybody belongs to everybody else. And if you can't have it, just take some soma to feel better. So this entire society is built around the fact that they don't want conflicts. But what's kind of interesting is that Aldous Huxley still managed to make that world convincing by developing certain conflicts that happen. So, you tell me, what types of conflict show up in Brave New World? Think about our main characters. Think about Bernard. Think about Henry. Think about Lena. Think about the Savage. What type of conflicts are showing up? Go ahead and just, in your journals, if you're still using those, go ahead and write about these conflicts. Also, write maybe just a paragraph, and remember, this is 100% free writing. You're not graded. Nobody's looking at it. Imagine what you would be doing if you were in one of these stories. How would you react? What would you do to solve the obstacles and problems of these settings? Until next time, when we discuss symbolism, thanks for reading and thanks for using educator.com.